morning, everyone in the audience. My name is Saar. I am excited to be the moderator today. I'm an investor at CRV. I'm also fortunate to work with Immad on Mercury. But I've known him for a while. We're going to talk a little bit about that on our panel today on pivoting. In our conversation today, we're going to speak to our panelists about their own experiences leading company pivots. But really, the hope of this panel is that all of you leave with some great insights as to how you might think about navigating your own pivots, whether to pivot, how to pivot successfully, etc. We've only got about 45 minutes planned for today. So rather than having you go around and do your own intros, which all three of you have just incredible backgrounds, and that could take 30 minutes alone, I'm just going to do a quick intro, and I apologize if I got some of this wrong. Some of this was my own research and given to me, but Immad, I know, so I'll start there. Immad is the co-founder and CEO of Mercury. As many of you know, Mercury is a bank to over 100,000 startups. As far as I remember, interestingly, I don't think Mercury has had to make any major pivots yet. But when I first met Immad, he was running a company called HeyZap, and I can at least remember from pitches from Immad that HeyZap went through a few pivots in his journey, I think 3 or 4, before building a business that was successfully acquired. Next, we have Hillary Lin. Hillary is the co-founder and CEO of Curio. Curio is a healthcare startup that uses technology to offer a holistic and more innovative approach to physical and mental healthcare. Hillary and her team made the pivot from a mental wellness company to a healthcare company in pursuit of product market fit, and we're excited to cover that. And lastly, we have Max Mullen. Max is one of the co-founders of Instacart. Instacart also has not had any major pivots that I'm aware of. But Max has a ton of experience, partly from experiencing a pivot in his first company called Volley. And he also has over 100 angel investments and has seen a number of his portfolio companies pivot over the years. So thank you all for participating. And maybe just to start with some stories, I wanted to focus on the actual decision to pivot, because I feel like that is often really not obvious. And I wanted to maybe hear from you just your own personal story of how did you make the decision to pivot your business? How did you know that you needed to make a major change? And if it was obvious, that's okay. That definitely happens with a lot of startups, but maybe Hillary, we can just start with your journey.
Very appropriate, since pivoting is part of the ongoing evolution of Curio. So the very short version is, so I'm a physician, and I actually started Curio out of my frustration with healthcare. I had been at Stanford for a decade and was tired of it. And not Stanford, I'm sorry, Stanford, I love you, but healthcare. And so I originally co-founded Curio as a wellness company because I wanted to be outside the healthcare system and innovate in that way. But the first big pivot we did early in our lifetime was to become a proper healthcare company. And that comes with a lot more legal setup and regulatory risk and a lot of money. And that's why a lot of people don't start healthcare companies, especially not care delivery ones. But we recognize that that's what we needed to do to have proper impact in the ways that we wanted to. And then probably the second big pivot was from a purely psychedelic assisted therapy company, which is what we spent last year doing completely. And this year we're focusing on a narrower part of our population, which is the cancer patient population and caregivers. And that decision was made because we want to be more implemented and embedded in the healthcare system. So it's kind of like I went full circle. I tried to leave and then I came back around, because you find out that sometimes you have to do the hard things to make the impact that you want. So
it sounds like, Hillary, I just want to try and maybe double click on it for a second before we move on to others. In your case, as if we were to try and map that to product market fit, did you have a product at the time, or was it just in searching for the mission of the problem you wanted to solve that you sort of were not happy with your initial direction and made a change?
Yeah, that's probably a better way to phrase it, is like almost a mission market fit, because we're a mixed services products company. So it's not like one particular product that's going on. It's we deliver healthcare. And so the way we do that is can be flexed in certain ways depending on the audience and population. So um so yeah, the phrase product market fit is a little bit funny because of the mixed nature of our company. But yeah, from the beginning, I have two co-founders, and we're all extremely passionate about improving people's well-being and fulfillment and happiness. And that was always the goal. And whether it was strictly by branding ourselves as a psychedelic company or rebranding in a way that sounds more familiar to healthcare institutions like insurance platforms or big health systems, that we're willing to flex in that way to get to the final outcome that we desire.
Great, thanks. Max, since I don't know the story of your first startup, I'd love to hear the pivot story and how did you make the decision?
Well, the first version of what we built was a product that required multiple people to download our app and use it together. And we just weren't growing. And the question was, are we not growing because our product isn't good enough or doesn't solve the problem well enough, or the problem isn't real? Or are we not growing because we're not distributing it smartly? It's not viral enough, we're not marketing it enough. And I think what I've learned over time is that the product is by default not good enough, right? If it's good enough, people will use it and tell you, and you'll know. And so sort of, I would assume working on the product to make it better is sort of one of the best solutions toward making it better. And then deciding to pivot is always this really tricky thing. Knowing if you have product market fit is also really tricky. And so we just took too long to do it. But after the first 6 months, we decided to take the feature in our product that was working the best, which was group messaging. This is in 2010, right before there were many group messaging startups, and really blow that up into the second version of our company. And almost overnight, we had 100x more users and more excitement around the product. And that's when we knew that was the right decision.
Fantastic. And Max, maybe just because we do hear often this story of like, hey, I just found this one feature that everyone seemed to be using, and that turned out to be the company. Just tell us a bit more. Like, was that obvious to you that the group chat was the feature, or was it just sort of like the best idea you had at the time, and knowing you needed to make a change and do something new?
Well, at the time, we thought we were geniuses and had discovered this really highly engaging thing that we could build a company around. But in retrospect, what we discovered is that messaging is by its nature sort of something that spreads through word of mouth and that's more engaging. And when you add messaging to any product, the numbers go up, right? You'll talk to social people that worked in social media companies and they'll tell you this. And so it wasn't enough in this case to be its own standalone company. And so, that company ended up not being extremely successful, and we sort of ended in a small acquisition. But as a first-time founder, you don't know these things. And so it can be really confusing and difficult to understand kind of where you're at on the product market fit spectrum. And I think a lot of people think about product market fit as this moment, but it's really not. It's really a spectrum, a gradient of how sticky your product is and how retentive it is and how great it is. And you kind of want to move down that spectrum. And also you want to understand where you're at relative to the past. So kind of measuring it and understanding it is key to kind of knowing, should we pivot or should we kind of double down?
And maybe just before I move to Immad, I'm just curious because, you've had tremendous success with Instacart. And I'm just curious, in those early days, did that sign of product market fit look similar, to your early group communication app, or very different?
So if we thought we had this much product market fit in the first version of our first company, then we thought we had an order of magnitude more product market fit in the second version of our first company, but turns out we didn't. Then this was like 2 orders of magnitude more. This is real product market fit, where the customers are pulling the product from you. People were trying to order Instacart from New York City when we only worked in San Francisco. There was like crazy things like that. calling us up and saying, I can't get this delivery time. I need this delivery time, right? Like customers being really passionate about what you do. And this question that I certainly didn't invent, which is around how upset would you be if we took the product away from you, being kind of a key indicator of product market fit.
Awesome.
So totally different.
Yeah, I think that's just such a great point because, there's very few Instacarts, right, to be fair. But I do think when companies really find that strong product market fit, in some cases, it is so obvious. And yet I think 99.9% of all startups, are in that messy middle trying to find that experience, that is so clear. Immad, maybe just switching to you. I know you've had a few pivots, but maybe just let's focus on one that you did at HeyZap and the story there. And I'd love to hear, how you decided not just to pivot, but like what you decided to pivot into, and was it obvious? How did you decide which direction to take?
I think generally speaking, entrepreneurs are like pretty stubborn, at least the successful ones are. So they are probably like late to pivoting. I think even though we pivoted 4 times, that was over 8 years. So in general, we stuck with what we were doing for 2 years, which was like at times like 1 year too long. One, I guess like the first pivot we did was we switched from, so we were doing Flash games. So that was the thing in 2008 or so. And then, mobile came out, and then eventually, iPhone had an app store. And it was very obvious that like Flash games were dying. And that all casual gaming would be mobile. It took us a while to just go, we need to make a mobile app, and it took us like a year to basically like from the point where I think it was pretty obvious to like actually going and like putting all of our focus behind that. So I think that's one thing. Like you can be too stubborn. I think the second part of that is, you really, I think to build a successful startup, you really do need like a market kind of tailwind, if that makes sense. Like you need something changing that's like positive. If you have market headwinds, I think it's really hard to build a successful startup, just because like it's just so hard to do everything right. And then like if you're in a market that's like disappearing, that's really hard. Whereas if you're in a market that's like blowing up, that makes it like way easier. So that's like some things to consider. I think like if you're really in a market where like it's changed fundamentally or it's dying in some way, I think like that's like a pretty good sign that you should like get out of it.
Yeah, I think to that point, I often use this description of fast moving water, right? Like where is there, you have things like mobile, people buy all these mobile phones, they spend all this money, they're trying to figure out what can I do with it. It creates this unique window, or, a new platform launches like Facebook. But related to timing, I'm just curious from your experience, and Max, your experience, how much does the timing matter? Like had Instacart launched, a year and a half, 2 years later, would it matter? Or, Immad, for your, pivot into mobile from Flash, you said maybe it was too late, but, you still executed it. How should entrepreneurs think about, just the urgency?
I mean, I would say for every time like I've done something has worked, like there's like a 1 or 2 year window that if I did it too much before that window or 2 years late, it would have been too late. So I think timing is crucial, but it is hard as an entrepreneur to get that timing right. With Mercury, if we were 2 years late, there would have been just way too much competition. And we were, pretty much the first kind of business bank focused on startups. In HeyZap at that time, we did a social network in 2011 or so. There was a time period where you could pull off like a mobile social network.
And is there a way to get data though to build that conviction? Or like, let's say a new platform launches or a new category, psychedelics launch.
Yeah.
Hillary, I'm looking at you. How do you know that like there's like, there's real money there, that there's like real consumer demand potentially? Can you use external, data to gain conviction, or do you just need to launch something and see? Can you prototype while you're running the company? Like, how do you run those experiments to just help you gain that conviction? Hillary?
Happy to jump in. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Love to hear your thoughts, Max, too. But my quick answer is it's complicated because sometimes you fight timing in two different areas. For example, we saw a big investment boom in psychedelics over, in 2017 in the biotech sphere, and then in 2022, 2021-ish, there was like a lot of excitement more in the care delivery. But what you're seeing is not the same kind of, activity in traditional healthcare. So I go back to all of my healthcare people, and they're still very wary of anything labeled psychedelic. It sounds like a music festival or something, right? So you have to kind of understand the multiple timing factors that are in play, and that's something we're constantly figuring out. And sometimes you have to almost tell two sides of the story depending on who your audience is. So, for example, when I'm talking to investors versus when I'm talking to doctors and folks in insurance, it's a very different type of tale, even though we're essentially creating the same product plus service.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's multiple factors related to timing. One is, in case of a consumer company, consumer behavior. Were people going to be ready for Instacart 5 years earlier? Was smartphone penetration there? Probably not. Another element of timing is venture capitalists. I mean, if your company is a scale business and needs a lot of funding to get to the unit economics you want, or to the network effects you want, if it's a marketplace, you're going to need to have multiple rounds of fundraising, and so you're going to need to have support from the venture community for what you're doing. And then there's the macro cycle, right? Companies like Instacart, prior to us having positive unit economics, were fundable. Today, you couldn't do that again, because that's not what is expected of companies, and so you have to be more lean. So there's a lot of elements of timing. But the thing is, I don't think the advice to founders is to try to time markets. I actually think it's to try to live in the future as much as possible. Talk to the smartest people working on the most interesting things on the edge of those things, and learn a lot. Early adopt as many things as you can. And then at a certain point, you can kind of read the tea leaves and just kind of tell that over the next 12 to 18 months, XYZ type things are gonna be important to your potential customers. And then you can build toward that. I think one of the worst things you can actually do is spend so much time evaluating timing and markets, and that you end up building in the rearview mirror, and you end up building something that that sort of is irrelevant by the time you're done building it.
Mm-hmm. What about, and I'm curious, because we, from where we've sit at CRV, we've seen some companies that it's like everyone pivots. Like it's like this is the new thing we're doing. We're not doing that anymore. We're doing this. And in other cases, we were lucky to be involved in companies that like Odeo that pivoted to Twitter, and Genie that pivoted to Yammer, where I'd say there were like skunkwork projects with a small team as they were exploring and looking for where to take the business. I'm just curious, how do you guys think about that as leaders? Like, can you, if you're trying to figure out the pivot, is it all hands on deck, everyone focus on one thing, or try and create a process internally to figure out where to go?
I think generally speaking, if you're a small team, it should be all hands on deck. It's relatively rare that the alternative works. I think both the cases, a lot of the alternative cases are companies with like entrepreneurs that were very heavily funded, and they'd raised a lot of money and hired a pretty big team and still didn't have product market fit. And then they had like some small projects going on. But every time I have done it and I have seen it done well, it's, maybe the first experiment for the first few months was not all hands on deck, but quite quickly it was.
Yeah, well, my comment was related to it, which is like, it's almost like related to what Immad was saying about size. There's a certain point where your company is almost too large to move. And it's also related to what I think is actually the most difficult part of pivoting, is telling the narrative for your internal team. So of course you have to tell a story to all of your external stakeholders, but that's almost easier because you can tell them whatever and they'll deal with it. But your internal team, you have to get on board, and you have to motivate everybody at a very high level. So you have to tell an extremely good reason and narrative for why you're trying this new pivot, which for all you know might not be the right one either, because everything's an experiment in a startup. So yeah. So keep it lean, I think.
The most important thing, like, there's a lot of important things, but the most important thing I think is after you've made the decision that you're going to pivot is to take stock of what you have. Okay. We have this much capital, which equates to this much runway. We have this team, they're committed and their skills are the following. We've learned the following things from the experiments we've run. And that leads us to have conviction that this might be the path or that might be the path. In some of the most sort of well-known examples of pivots, you talked about Twitter, but there's also like Slack and others, which I think these are outliers, by the way. I think what happened is they took stock of what they had and they had a bunch of ideas and a really smart team. And they essentially converted their original idea into a startup studio for a few months and then gravitated toward one of the ideas and built that into the next company. That's one model. But I mean, I think the majority of pivots, it's in the name, right? You're planting one foot and you're pivoting the other one toward the same customer, different problem, or same problem, different solution. And so I think if you have the ability to kind of stay 50% in the same direction, but just pivot the company ever so slightly and be successful that way, that's the first stop. But sort of the method is to take stock of what you have and see what you can do.
Yeah. Max, I think you bring up a really great point, and maybe we'll be able to share later in the Meridian magazine, actually, that Mercury put out. There was Eric Ries put out there's like 25 ways to pivot, and the framework I thought was interesting in that, to your point, I think there are sometimes teams that come together because their main goal is to build a successful company. And that means that, and I was lucky to be involved in AdMob, but Omar started with like an SMS newsletter. And then in trying to buy ads, he pivoted to an ad business, and to his credit, his goal was to build a successful company and an org, and so that was a pretty big pivot in terms of what they were working on, but successful because the overall objective was still true in terms of what Omar was trying to build. And yet, to go back to Hillary's point, like Hillary's very mission oriented. Like if she found some insight trying to buy mobile ads, it's unlikely that she's going to be able to pull her team into building a mobile ad business. And I think that's like, in this execution, so much of how you've recruited people, what have you sold them? Why did they join? You have to take account of as you start to navigate a pivot, because if you show up with like a totally, an idea that's different than what you sold them on, there's going to be a lot of thrashing there. Same with actually resourcing, to your point on the type of business or the direction you're going. I think you have to take stock of the skills and talents and say, is this the right team to go after this business? If now we're moving from, let's say, prosumer to enterprise sales, like, does anyone on this team know anything about complicated enterprise sales? You may not be able to take that existing team with you into that new business as well.
I think another factor is being really kind of transparent and honest with the team. I think one thing that I did badly in my early pivots was not do that. Like, I think it's very easy for early entrepreneurs to be like, oh, it's all amazing. This move is amazing too. Like, it's a rocket ship still. Whereas like, I think if people can, smell that bullshit. I think if you are much more like honest about it and it's like, hey, this isn't working. Here's all the things that's not working, but we're not going to give up. Like, this is what we're going to do next. Like, people can get behind that authenticity and honesty, and they'll be like, okay, oh yes, it's obvious it wasn't working. Like, I'm glad we have a plan, rather than like, we're not doing anything about it kind of thing. So I think that's really a pivotal part of pivoting, is to be authentic and honest and transparent with the team along the journey.
And maybe I'm just curious, because I know you raised venture for HeyZap.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious in this relationship with the people that gave you money and the expectations that they had. How do you tell your investors, when should you tell your investors that you're thinking of making a change, relative to what you sold them when they invested?
Yeah, I think it's actually similar. Like, I think you want to be, hopefully you've communicated every step of the way and they can see that you've really tried with the existing market and like, these are the numbers and they're not being successful. And, by the time they should also know that like, this is the right decision. And from an investor perspective, I think, I would much rather see one of the companies I invested in go pivot and try something new, especially if it's like exciting and they can sell me on that, rather than keep bashing their head at something that is obviously not working. And you can tell as an investor if like someone's 6 months in and their numbers are flat, like, it's normally very obvious. And I'm much happier to hear they're trying something new and pivoting than like every month they're giving me like the same report and nothing's changing. The bit that I really dislike actually as an investor, which has happened a couple of times, is when someone has been painting this rosy picture. They're like, oh, it's just going so well, blah, blah, blah. And then the next month later, they're like, now we're pivoting. And I'm like, what? Like, you just, like a month ago, it was like, they were about to close something and everything seemed so great. So I think like in order to like build that trust with your investor base, like you have to kind of be honest with your struggles, and then I think most investors will be fairly happy about it. Like, they've already invested. If they almost get 2 shots at the goal, right? Like this, like someone tried doing one thing, it didn't work, they didn't get product market fit, now they're going to try something else. So that's generally like it feels like a good event for an investor. So, but it does involve like communicating and explaining everything, especially with like investors that have kind of bigger stakes in the company.
Don't go dark. I mean, a lot of times companies, they don't know what to say, so they just don't say anything for 6 months. First of all, angel investors know that's a really bad sign. But second of all, you could get help from those investors if you're honest, especially if you pick a couple that will really lean in and meet with you and help you. Shout out to Immad, who's an incredible founder, and every investor update's very detailed, and he always does what he says he's going to do, which is the most amazing thing to see over time. And then also helps that, Mercury's numbers are always going up, and like every investor update, it's like very exciting to read.
I'm curious, Max, since you have so many angel investments, for some of these companies that have pivoted, have you ever pushed back and said, aren't you doing this too soon? Have you always trusted your founders that they're making the right decision? Just to get in the head of, as an investor, what your reaction is when you hear about some of these pivots.
Yeah, I mean, you always have to trust the founders. I mean, you're not going to run their business, and so basically, if they tell you they have conviction in something, that's law. I might ask clarifying questions. I might say, why do you believe this? What customer development have you done? I might ask, sort of questions that help expand on what more they could do to make the second version of the company successful, or really try to get them to write down what they learned from the first version of the company if they haven't done that. But I try to be collaborative, ask questions, and then occasionally they ask me to workshop with them a couple different new paths, sort of pros and cons, and we'll sort of do that live or do that over a Google Doc, and that can be helpful in the middle of a pivot.
Yeah, I think there's just a really important point here that, especially for many younger first-time founders that take capital, I think there can be a real hesitation to pivot because you sold this dream, because you got these, like you're almost nervous to bring up the topic, or you feel like you should just keep grinding, even though it may be obvious to everyone that you should be doing something different. And so, the point, I guess I'd say, is like, at least for most of the investors I've worked with, not all, there's a few outliers who invest in a specific idea and like, don't want you to pivot, but they're really outliers. I'd say at least in most of my career, most investors just want the company to be successful, the founders to be successful. And so the more that you just know that's the intent, to the extent that you can even have your investors as thought partners. Should I pivot? Here's how I'm thinking about things. This data is not obvious. Sometimes you can actually get, some great ideas like, oh, did you know that, Apple's launching an SDK, or this thing is going to happen, like Facebook's going to launch a platform, and you should pay attention to this thing. Sometimes that can make all the difference. But if you're just too closed and nervous to bring it up, you can miss out on some of these great ideas or opportunities of where there may be that fast moving water or some great advice. Just since it's so topical, I wanted to just cover AI for a few minutes, because I feel like, one of the things that, when you talk about hype cycles, sometimes there are hype cycles where there really is a lot of new usage, demand, like, as we talked about in consumer businesses, a new platform. But there's also just like new technologies that can capture people's imaginations, or new things that might feel very disruptive. And I think often people feel like, oh shit, this is going to change our industry today, and everyone's got to like, change everything immediately. And generally these things take a lot longer than planned, and you might not need to pivot your business today when GPT, whatever, OpenAI launches some new code. So I'd love to hear your views just for a few minutes on AI, and how should startups think about the hype cycle around AI, reasons to pivot into AI or not and stay the course. What comes to mind when I bring this topic up?
For us, I think.
Go ahead, Hillary.
Oh yeah, I think for us it's kind of interesting because I don't generally like to follow hype. I know that sounds crazy because I'm in the psychedelics world, but I truly believe in the utility of like what it is. And for us, we just went ahead and started using AI in our services and products and thought like how it could help us. And so you can see that in some of our products now, and we are not super loud about it. We're not like saying like, oh, we're building a AI health company now. It's an AI enabled health tech company, and that's just what it is. And it's definitely accelerated a lot of our product development and made easier a lot of the things we do. So it just is. But I think that's the thing to like ask yourself, like when you're founding a company and deciding, do I buy into this new trend, is see if it actually is useful for you and your customers. If it's not, then maybe you're just getting overly excited by a new trend.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's like two fairly separate types of AI pivots, right? There's like a AI as a tooling to help enable your original mission or vision or idea a little better. And I think if you have that kind of idea, it'll be almost irresponsible not to at least like understand how you might use it. And if there's some features that you can include to enable a better experience, and it might turn out that AI is too early or whatever, and you can't do it yet, but you should at least like know what you can and can't do. I think the other thing that I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs about recently is that like the thing I'm doing isn't working at all. I want to do an AI idea. I think that is like a lot more kind of fraught with I don't want to judge them, but like probably ending up in a bad pivot. I think there's like, if you have like a deep insight about an industry, or you just, you're a doctor and you understand healthcare, or you're a lawyer or you work with lawyers, and if there's something like that and you can apply AI, I think that is a good idea and you should explore it. I think if you really don't have that kind of thing and you're just going to be one more entrepreneur kind of chasing, I don't know, like customer support AI company kind of thing, like there's going to be so many of them that like it's going to be very hard to build a company there, and it's going to, I think that will be like a difficult space to be in. So I think if you're going to approach AI now, I think you need some deep insight and experience in a very specific field to apply it to.
I might take the other side of that, or maybe just a different take, which is like, it's fast moving water. You can use that to your advantage in a bunch of ways. You can make your company more productive. You can weave it into your product. If you pivot, you can consider pivoting like closer to it, since that's where investors are interested and maybe customers are more interested. But like, just be honest with yourself. Don't do it because it's the hot thing. Do it because it's the right thing. And also understand that investors can kind of sniff this stuff out. And if you just like change your company to a .ai domain and think that that's going to materially impact anything, it's not. So it has to be authentic, and you have to play with the technology and understand how you're actually going to use it to serve customers better. And if you have a good answer to that, then maybe it's worth considering.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, because we spend a lot of time thinking about this, because we see a lot of these teams who are not technical, with, a dozen of the same ideas and trying to make heads or tails of it. I think there's some interesting points that you guys already brought up. I mean, first, in terms of, there is an advantage, I think, when you see a lot of consumer interest, and in AI broadly, when you look at the numbers of just like I cannot think of many things in the last decade or so where if you look at direct traffic to OpenAI of people using ChatGPT or Character.ai, you're talking about hundreds of millions of, people that without these companies, just true organic traffic. And a lot of these similar enterprise companies are seeing a lot of just consumer interest. And so I do think in that fast moving water, getting in front of that with a product as a way to learn and figure out what do people want, can be an opportunity. I go back to the conviction can just be, oh, there's a lot of consumer interest and I just want to get in front of that and figure out what it is. When I think of early on Facebook platform, Mark Pincus was working on a toolbar. The toolbar wasn't the answer, but it got him to put something out there and see what Facebook users wanted to do. And then the toolbar led to a poker app, which led to a gaming company. It was kind of this journey, but the users kept coming in. And so he could just iterate to figure out what is it that these people might want to do outside of browsing Facebook. And I think there is a story like that if you can actually get in front of those users. The challenge right now with AI, right, is it's very hard to position yourself and be a part of that conversation. And so then I think to some of the comments you guys made, I think you do also need to take stock of what is your team uniquely capable of. Should we move into hardware if your team doesn't know anything about building hardware? Probably not. If you really need to make a pivot and have to figure out where to go, figure out, okay, what is our team very good at executing? And let's keep that maybe in the focus. And then trying to figure out, how do we get a unique insight? How do we know something that the rest of the world doesn't know? Sometimes that can be, to Max's point, I think launching something and then trying to learn, because that gives you the insight that no one else knows. But often if you can't get the users in the door, you may not actually have a path to get those unique insights. And then you might end up looking like, hundreds of other teams that are just kind of looking at the same thing and wondering why they can't break out and stand out. But I think it's always a tough challenge in these spaces.
I think you bring up a good point, just to bring in an example of what happened in the hypey sort of psychedelic age too, is a lot of people got excited and then suddenly everyone wanted to create essentially a therapeutic center. And I think the people who ended up succeeding were those who stuck to their strengths, like you were saying. For example, if you're a media team or a person or a company, then, creating media around psychedelics is huge business and huge industry. And you don't need to become a healthcare institution. That's not necessarily the thing that you need to do to, take advantage of a certain trend, for example. And I think it's the same thing for AI. I see that a lot. My partner happens to be an AI scientist. And you look at a lot of companies and a lot of people are like, we're going to improve the AI. And I'm like, do you understand what that takes? That takes so much high level expertise and experience and money, so much money. And so a lot of times you're thinking about, okay, how can I use this AI trend and essentially what I am good at? Maybe I'm really great at, I don't know, media or something. And then you have to stick to your strength, even though you're pivoting into an interesting trend.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add that I just spoke to an entrepreneur today, actually, who was like, oh, I have this idea, but there's two people kind of doing this idea. And oh, it's an AI, so that I'll have hundreds of competitors. But, he really believed in the idea. And I think if you have a unique insight and you really believe in it, I don't think you should be put off by it being a kind of noisy space. I would say in the next 6 to 12 months, the hype cycle part of it will probably be over. And a lot of those people will not stick through it. If you really believe in something and you're willing to spend the next 10 years of your life doing it, you're in a unique position that most people, my experience with most competitors is they're not around if you just kind of focus on things and keep doing them.
Well, and I think you bring up a great point, which, we often talk about things only in the context of these big venture-backed outcomes. But, the amazing thing about being an entrepreneur, depending on how you fund the business, is you can do things because you just want to do them and you believe there's a business. This is the problem you want to work on with the people you want to work on it with for a long period of time. So, that's a totally great reason also to pursue, AI or whatever it may be. We've got one question from the audience, I guess, that we didn't actually cover. And I actually think it's intellectually interesting in that we didn't define like what is a pivot and what's not a pivot. And I do think companies, as their product market fit, can be elusive. And as companies evolve, you're constantly building new products and sort of, evolving the product. So, I guess I'd love to know, Hillary and Max, what do you think, in terms of just defining the pivot versus not a pivot in your minds?
That's so hard to answer. I kind of like the phraseology of saying evolution better, because I feel like that's more representative of what Curio's experience has been like, because it's a constant evolution. I think it's a pivot when you suddenly have to make new partners. Like you suddenly, like, and I saw that, like when I described the two pivots that we went through, at the core, team's the same, doing a lot of similar same things even, but we had to, talk to different partners and create new sort of channels for referrals and things like that. And that felt bigger because we had to change our branding and messaging in a big way.
I would say, refining your product, talking to customers, learning new things, changing your go-to-market. These are like, you're driving somewhere and you change the destination, not a big deal. A real pivot is like getting out of the car and getting in a boat. It's like a totally different thing. You might need a different team, per your point. You're building a different solution to the same problem, or you're changing the problem you're solving entirely. And generally it's followed by a hard decision you can't go back on, and a period of rebuilding something before you actually go back out to market. So you're unwinding, pausing, and then going back out. That's like my definition of a pivot.
Those are great examples. Immad, any view? What's not a pivot?
I think if you're throwing away like 90% of the software you built and you're building another 90% of new software, then that's definitely a pivot. I guess everything I've built has been like a software product, so that's mostly how I view it. But yeah, I mean, going up market, down market, slightly different industry, same product. Like that's just like the entrepreneurial journey, right? Like you're always trying to like find your way to product market fit. Even, yeah, you can change a lot. There's was it the ship of Theseus kind of argument as well? But most of the time when I've done it, it's not been a question of like, is it a pivot or not? It's been like very obvious that this is like something completely new.
Strange. Well, I hate to say it, but we're out of time, guys. I'm so grateful for all of you participating and for the awesome comments. I hope that those of you in the audience leave with some good insights and advice as you think about whether and how to pivot. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it to the Mercury team to follow up if there's other questions or other ways we can help. But thank you all for joining today. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for hosting, Saar. Thanks, everyone.
It was fun.